Good afternoon, everybody. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. And we're going to be discussing the important topic of whether you can be anything in Ireland but English. And I'm sure some of you read Finn O'Toole's column last week that reflected on the scale and nature of migration into Ireland. He made a comparison between Ireland now and the peak of inward migration to the United States in 1870 and 1920. And at that stage, 1 in 7 people in America in that melting plot were born outside of that country. And today in Ireland, according to Census 2022, 1 in 5 people in this country are born overseas. So the scale of migration into Ireland is really dramatic. Anyone who can remember pre-2004, which I think is everybody in this room actually, the dramatic scale of change is really evident. And I think this discussion today is just made all the more pertinent by that. Now, we have an excellent panel today, and you're going to hear very little from me before I hand over to them. We have Ambassador Paul Johnston, who is the UK Ambassador to Ireland, and Paul is here in his personal capacity. We're also joined by Finn McRedmond, who's a columnist of the Irish Times and the New Statesman. We have Professor Neil Robinson, who is a professor in comparative politics at the University of Limerick. And we have Etain Tannam, who's a professor at the School of Religion at Trinity College Dublin. These are all very welcome, and just again to say how pleased I am to have this opportunity, Porrick and colleagues at ARINS. We're going to get straight down to business with a simple question that I think could afford a long, drawn-out answer, but I'll ask you each to be quick in the first instance. I want to try and understand this topic better, and for me it's about anti-English sentiment. It's certainly a thing in some quarters, and it's worth ventilating and discussing. So my first question to each of you is, what do you think the topic is about, and why does it matter? And as you answer, if you want to explain how you relate yourself to English and Englishness, please do. So what's the topic about and why does it matter? I'll start with you, Paul.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I think, to me, the topic has two sort of connotations. When you say it's all right to be anything in Ireland now, that seems to speak to me to Ireland becoming a much more, or being a much more maybe plural, diverse, secular, inclusive society than it would have been when some of the people here were growing up, say, in the 70s and 80s. But the second half, the less positive connotation in the second half of the sentence, as long as it's not English, implies some continuing anti-Britishness or anti-Englishness. I have to say I've lived overseas in Paris, New York, Stockholm, and Brussels before coming to Dublin. I've never sort of reflected as much on being British as I have done in this country. It was never a feature in any of the other sort of places I've lived, and there's various reasons for that we can get into. I have to say, and it's maybe being a Scottish person, that I don't feel the anti-Britishness very much at all. I come across some anti-Englishness, but almost sometimes in a sort of comic, postmodern, iconic way, in the same way as one does in Scotland. In fact, I would say sometimes in a more gentler, less chippy way here than you come across in aspects of Scottish society. So I think it's partly a positive reflection on Ireland's journey, if that's not a patronising thing for a blow-in to say. But it's also, I think, a little bit about maybe some residual and some maybe more modern sort of anti-British stroke anti-English sentiment.
And just finally, before I hand over to Finn to hear her view, how do you relate to England and Englishness? Are you English?
So no, I'm Scottish. I would say I'm sort of Scottish, British, European, mixture of all three. I've lived in London roughly half my adult life, but I've lived in the US and across Europe for the other half. I represent the UK government, so I represent England to that extent. When it comes to rugby, I would see myself as very much Scottish rather than English. But when it comes to football, I really like the English football team, the way they play and the sort of values they represent. I love English cricket, so it's a sort of a messy hybrid, like a lot of these things.
I think it's actually English and Welsh cricket, isn't it? Don't they play as a unit? Isn't it?
I'm not sure there's a formally speaking a Welsh team. I think it's always English, but they've had some very fine Irish players like Owen Morgan,
certainly,
and some Welsh players as well.
Thanks, Paul. Finn, over to you.
I'm a columnist at the Irish Times and then also at the British magazine, The New Statesman. I have an English mother and an Irish father. This leads to many accusations of being a West Brit, which is not necessarily a term I particularly like. I prefer to be known as an Irish Londoner. Irish person, I've been living in London for about 7 years now, in the UK for 3 years before that. This question, what's drawing me particularly to this question is some kind of erroneous belief that I think has taken over Irish discourse at the moment, which is that English people are particularly nationalist, or English people are particularly nastily nationalist, and that England is an increasingly nationalist place. I don't think this is true, but I think it's a source of a lot of Irish antagonism towards Britain and England. So when we talk about anti-Englishness in Ireland, I think this is a really good place to start unpicking our mistakes. And that's it.
Thanks a million, Finn. So next, if I can still remember my alphabet, the next person will be Professor Robbins.
Thank you very much. Well, obviously I am English, although my father was Scots, and I spent a considerable part of my childhood in Wales. I would not have seen myself as being English, I think, when I was growing up and during the first 30 odd years of my life when I lived mostly in England. I think actually in many ways I had to come to Ireland to become English because my identity, I think, growing up would have been British and European. There would have been certain affections that I had for certain English things, you know, sort of the cricket team of the early 1980s. But, you know, sort of apart from that, Englishness was not really something that was a defining feature of my life. I think you get that when you come to Ireland, simply because the parts of your identity and your knowledge are picked apart. Not often in an unfriendly fashion. It's frequently reminding you of certain occurrences and pointing out some of the small differences that exist between yourself and the people that are around you. And as we all know, thanks to Freud, there can be a certain narcissism based on small differences which magnify them and make them more important than they perhaps are. So, you know, sort of I think that Englishness, however, has become an issue for us over the last decade or so. And I think it is partly because of the way devolution has worked out over time and, you know, sort of England being seen once again as a limiting power on the aspirations of a Celtic nation, Scotland in this case. And then because of the sort of increased discourse of Englishness, with Englishness being a bearer of the identity of Brexit. So I think to a great extent that those are media and elite attitudes as much as they are popular attitudes. But they have raised the question of Englishness again in a way that, you know, sort of I had after my first 15 years in Ireland begun to forget and see fade into the background. So it is a live issue for us once again.
I thought when you mentioned Freud, you were going to throw that hand grenade that the Irish are meant to be the only nation impervious to psychoanalysis. I think that's something I remember hearing.
Well, I think the British are the English are as well. But so you know, sort of, I think Freud got that one wrong. But that's my only Freud quote. So you know, sort of, we'll have to leave the psychoanalysis there.
I'm spent as well on that. So, Etain.
So my interest in the topic is that I lived in England where I met Neil during my MA in Essex, 87, and then part of my PhD and then the LSE. So I think roughly 7 years I lived in England. And my late husband was English as well, from the East Midlands, like Neil as well. So I suppose that's informed me. I would think if I hadn't that experience, I wouldn't be here talking. I don't think I'd notice anything, actually, because, you know, I remember the views I'd have had before my experience of England. And like Finn, and something Frank McNally, who writes for the Irish Times, once said years ago, unless you've lived in England, you don't really know English people. So the gap between some Irish people's perception of English people, and I think Brexit has made it worse, as being nationalist or having an imperialist hangover, it's very different from the reality of the welcome and the friendliness I received in England. And particularly, I suppose, there's generational differences as well. So Neil was talking about his identity growing up I was saying earlier, my husband's experience and a lot of people his age, there was a slight shame about being English because of the past. Rather than a sort of jingoistic thing, it was the opposite among, he would be 57, like, I don't know what age Neil is actually, roughly that age.
Roughly.
So there's a shift actually among younger people, most of whom voted Remain. And I suppose that's my interest in the topic, that it's a complex place like anywhere, and there have been many stereotypes that seem to have become a bit more dominant, perhaps linked to Irish nationalism as well.
Thanks very much, Etain. I should say I am packed full of questions I could put to this very interesting panel, but what I should have said at the outset is we have microphones here, and from this point onwards, I'm very happy for anybody to interrupt if anyone has a question. So before getting into conversation, are there any burning questions or points anybody would like to raise at the outset? And if you could just introduce yourself with an affiliation if you have one that's relevant.
Hello, Andy Pollock. A very simple question to the panel. Why is it that the Union Jack is almost uniquely never shown in public among all flags in the world in this country?
Okay, so a very specific one on the flag, on the Union Jack. I don't expect everyone to have a view on that, but does anyone have a view on that of the four panelists?
I hadn't noticed that. I hadn't noticed that, but now that you say it, I think there is a knee-jerk reaction about the Union Jack as well. I think that's quite true. And I have some friends who would be very like me, I suppose very liberal, and I remember one of them saying recently that despite all her rational instincts, when she sees the Union Jack, when she crosses the border, there's a recoiling feeling. Now that's connected, of course, to perceptions of loyalism as well, but I think that's interesting. I hadn't noticed, but I think it does go back to the particular history and perceptions we have that predate Brexit.
Neil, were you just shifting your seat to put the mic closer to you? Yeah,
well, I was shifting, but and I think Etain's kind of rather hit it on the head there. I must admit, it's not something that I'd particularly noticed. I mean, I know there have been various occasions where I've seen visiting British dignitaries, your predecessor, for example, and the flag has been put up. But I do think, yeah, it is one of those. There are certain flashpoints, I think, where sort of you can always see that reaction from Irish people about certain elements of Englishness and Britishness. The other one is Oliver Cromwell. I mean, sort of my impressions of Cromwell and those of Irish people. Historically, you've changed my mind, would have been very, very different. And those sort of, there are a few points, and I think the Union flag is simply one of those.
Paul, do you have anything to say? You don't have to. I do know that there's you have a shared interest in sport, and that there is a time in the year here you could walk into any pub in the country and see the flags of the nations. But I think Mr. Pollock's question specifically pertained to the Union Jack, yeah?
I never see the Union Jack flying in public outside a pub or a hotel.
Yeah, so we're specifically talking about the Union Jack as opposed to the flag of the nations. So I'm implying that the Six Nations, sometimes in a pub you might see the colours of the Union, of the nations, but not of the Union.
But I suppose that's because it's the nations rather than the Union that competes in the Six Nations. The one sort of flag-related incident that occurs to me is I was going to give a talk, funnily enough, the Jean Monnet lecture, and I thought I might be in career trouble back home doing it, but I chose to do it about European security rather than about sort of Brexit. But I was giving the Jean Monnet lecture at University College Cork, and they very kindly put up the Union Jack on top of the college buildings to welcome my arrival, and that attracted some criticism from some of the students and sort of local comments in social media. But to me, that was just sort of water off a duck's back. Yeah.
Finn, no pressure. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I think raising the flag to another country can be, a mark of respect and a nice thing to do, but it's not normal for one country to revere another country's flag. It would be an odd thing to expect of Ireland to have Union Jacks all over the city, and with the very rare exception of the few Irish pubs dotted around London, you don't see the tricolour anywhere. Why would you? It's not. I don't think it's particularly nationalist to suggest that as well.
Can I just add something?
Absolutely. And I'm going back to you with a question on education in a second, Finn, if that's all right.
Just connected to that, I think what we'd notice here, or what I'd notice, and I'd say most people, is that if England is playing another team, there'd be a tendency not to support England. And that doesn't happen in England about Ireland. There would tend to be support for Ireland. And the second thing I'd notice, related sort of tangentially, is there's often mockery of English people going on about the 1966 World Cup. And yet, you know, we've a tendency to go on about the quarterfinal we got to in 1990. So there's a lack of self-reflection, I think, when we're judging, perhaps judging anyone, but judging England particularly, about how we can be quite nationalistic ourselves about these things.
To be honest, we are a bit annoying about it. But
Well, the role of flags is still so central to politics on this island that we may come back to it over the course of the discussion. But I just want to ask you, Finn, something, just given your specific circumstance, having you identified being half British, half Irish, and having been educated in both islands, right? Can you reflect a little bit in your views on the role of education in either forming or not forming these attitudes, and how maybe attitudes in schools in Ireland differ to those in Britain?
Yeah, I think it's been a kind of commonly noted phenomenon, especially since Brexit, that there's a kind of imbalance in knowledge, which is to say that Irish students at school learn a lot about Anglo-Irish history, and that English students in English schools learn almost nothing of Anglo-Irish history. I think that's probably true. I think it's also a slightly unfair way to approach the problem. Irish students learn about Anglo-Irish history. They don't learn about English history. I don't know anything about the Tudors. I don't know anything about Cromwell from the perspective that you might have learned about Cromwell. I know about England through the lens of Ireland, which is a very different thing to having a great depth of knowledge about England imparted to me when I was a teenager at school here. The alternative is that, yes, English students don't learn anything about Irish history as far as I can understand from speaking to many of them. Many of them are my very good friends. They don't know anything. But English history is also vast and expansive, and there's a lot to learn about. You know, they know a lot more about Britain's role in India than I know about Ireland's role in empire creation. And that's often something that's forgotten. So I think it's an unfair imposition to suggest that all students need to know equal amounts about Ireland and equal amounts about England. That's silly. I think where it does matter, this imbalance in education and imbalance in knowledge, is at a kind of higher, more technical level, at a political level or at the level of a media. That you can't necessarily have ministers in the British government not knowing what the Red Hand of Ulster is, or not knowing how sectarianism influences voting patterns in the north, and making kind of insensitive comments in that regard. That's where the imbalance of knowledge matters. It doesn't matter what 16-year-olds learn at school, so long as they're willing, as they move through their life, to stay open-minded, open to receiving new information, and adapting their interests as the world changes around them.
Excellent. Thanks a million, Finn. And there's a lot to be said as well for the, I should have said I lived in the UK for 10 years. I don't think I said that at the outset, but in Ireland I've always consumed way more British media because it's available and very good compared to the opposite. And obviously there's a gravitational pull when it comes to the UK as well, just that its politics is very interesting. That I've always been sensitive to people not knowing the minutiae of Irish history, but I agree with your final point, that I have encountered people working in academia and politics, so I would have often thought ought to have known better and who didn't. Does anyone else want to comment on this? I'd like to come to each of you on this question, actually, because I think it's of specific. Each of you had different experiences of education in Ireland and in the UK. Etain, do you have any views, having, I don't know, spent time yourself studying in the UK and the role of education as put to Finn?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's ignorance very much in England of Ireland and of Irish sensitivities, without a doubt. I was saying that to you earlier, Barry, is it Shaw or Wilde, about history being something English people should remember and Irish people should forget? I think that's an element. And I remember myself going over first to England, I would say, very hypersensitive about being Irish, very aware of my identity in a way that I think was to do with history, and I wouldn't have come from a particularly nationalistic background at all. So I think there's ignorance in both places. I think we're more aware of it, and sometimes perhaps a bit too sensitive about it, would be one thought. I do think it matters, the education system. I think particularly if there's a referendum on unification. I mean, recently it's been revealed how little young people know about the Good Friday Agreement, which is connected to our understanding of identities and the history of the islands. So I think it's something actually that the government neglected and should have paid more attention to, because there's a very simplistic understanding of history, not just not knowing about England, but not really knowing our history in any great depth. And I think that could be problematic later.
I think I would very much like to come to a question on unity to the panel, which I could dream up, but if anyone in the audience would like to come in on that in a few moments, I'd like to put something to you, Neil, and feel free to comment in the way that Finn and Etain did, but I'm also curious yourself. You're a comparative political scientist, correct?
Yeah.
That I spent a long time teaching and studying in the UK, where Irish studies is vibrant and they're professors of Irish studies. How many British studies professors do we have in Ireland? Are you aware?
I'm not sure we have too many. But you say there's Irish studies professors, but I think it's a very specific thing. I mean, I think you'll find a lot of those would be historians or in the humanities. Certainly in the area of political studies, sort of the North is not something that is taught very much. I mean, I remember way back when I had my first job in a university in the north of England, there being a huge battle between the people who team taught the core British politics course about whether they should put on more than 1 week about the North. And in the end, they didn't. And it would be very, very rare to find anybody who had done an Irish politics course. The most that they might have got is 5 minutes on the single transferable vote during a comparative electoral studies module. And I went back. I thought, has this changed? And I went back and I looked at various syllabuses, and I looked at, several universities when I was killing time on my long journey back to here, and no, it hasn't. I mean, there are a few people dotted around. They are often, you often see that there are people who have a specialism of some sort in Irish politics, but they'll often be teaching something which Ireland plays a part. So they might be teaching a course about nationalism more generally, and there'll be a section in Ireland there, or they might be teaching something about peace and reconciliation, and there'll be something about the North in there. So there's very little specific Irish content at most UK higher education institutions outside of the humanities. I think it would be easier to do a module on James Joyce than it would on the Irish political system. So it is, I think, a huge problem, and always has been a huge problem.
Excellent, thank you very much, Neil. Would you like to comment in any way, Paul, about the role of education in England in shaping any sense of Englishness as well? I don't know if you have any view on that.
So I did all my education in Scotland, and certainly didn't learn very much about Irish history, but then again didn't learn very much about French or German history. It was mainly sort of British history and a certain amount of American history. And then at university did politics and history and international relations, but still didn't know very much about Ireland. I think there is this big asymmetry that Irish people maybe don't know a lot about British history, except through one angle of it, Cromwell being a good example. And I did a talk, in fact, did a panel with Fintan O'Toole at Trinity College when they were launching their project on Cromwell. And both of our themes was how someone is very well known in both countries, but through almost entirely parallel experiences. The Civil War on the British side and the sort of genocidal campaigns on the Irish side. But I think the current asymmetry is that Irish people just know a lot more about Britain because they absorb British politics and British media and are fascinated by it, particularly maybe over the last 10 years, whereas British people on the whole don't know that much. I think wouldn't know Irish politics in any detail at all, would know much more about the New Hampshire primary and the Iowa caucus than they would probably about the fact that there's going to be an Irish general election next autumn, and potentially quite a big implication coming out of it, depending on what happens. So I think there is this current asymmetry, even if the symmetrical experiences of education are that neither of us knows as much about each other's history through education as we probably should do.
Thanks very much, Paul. Does anybody else want to come in?
Good good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jane Ohlmeyer. I'm Professor of History at Trinity College Dublin. And given this conversation, just wanted to simply intervene to say, I think when it comes to identity formation, our history in Ireland is so core to who we are today. And even the very fact that we're talking about Cromwell, the reality was Ireland was England's first colony, and Northern Ireland may well be its last. That's just a fact. And I think that we have to be much more honest about how we engage with our history. And I think the Cromwell project was a lovely example of that. But going back to the observation around the flag and the Union Jack, there are lots of sensitivities around it because of that imperial hangover, to paraphrase Etain. And I think that, 100 years into independence, we're actually beginning to have these conversations that are awkward and difficult. But as we have them, I also think we need to think about the role that we as Irish people played in empire, and particularly the British Empire. And to Finn, to pick up on what you said, 2/3 of the British Army in India were Irish. They were all over India, but nobody really wants to acknowledge this. So I just think it's a really important moment for us as a community to engage with that history, because I think we've not been doing it. And obviously I'd like to make a plug. I've just published a book called Making Empire, which does exactly this, but very much from the perspective of early modernity. But I think early modernity is still very much part of who we are in Ireland. 1690, 1641, Cromwell, they're part of our DNA, and there's no escaping that. So let's acknowledge it and actually engage with it.
Congratulations on your recent book. I'll gather this, and there was another question or remark over here, and I give you each a chance to respond if you wish, without any pressure. Pauline, this gentleman here.
It's Shay Garvey. I'm the chair of the Irish Times. I was lucky enough to live in Belgium and then France, Canada, and then the US, and obviously Ireland. I'm from Ireland, but I live in the UK. And there's very similarities between a small country looking into a big country, right? The small country, by definition, is highly sensitive, especially because of the imperial past. But if you live in Belgium, they're as sensitive about France, because there is no symmetrical understanding or knowledge. Why should there be? I mean, it's the size of the population, the economy, etc. So to me, yes, I think there are particularities, and I think Jane has highlighted probably the biggest issue. But there's a lot of similarities, I think, between small countries adjoining big countries, where they share a common language, a common history, or whatever. So I would tend to, just accept it for what it is, and it evolves. It's 100 years post-independence. Of course there was a huge amount of sensitivity, but I think we're getting through that.
Everyone does. And I could just say as well, Shay, having grown up in Belgium and living there as a child and as an adult, it's made even more complicated by the Flems as well. It's a fascinating little country, but there's the Walloons and the Flems, obviously Walloons to France, and the Flems to the Netherlands as well. And I absolutely take your point about big and little countries being neighbours like that. So we have the comment from Professor Ohlmeyer and from Shay Garvey. I'll just invite you each. We can leave them hang there, or Finn, if you'd like to respond to either.
Yeah, I think they're both very interesting points. And I think just one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is relevant to your book, and just to slightly elaborate on what I was saying earlier about this idea of the English as this, still this imperialist kind of nasty, overweening people, which seems unfair, and while also refusing to acknowledge that Ireland played a role in empire too, because acknowledging that makes the picture ambiguous and complicated and muddy, and complicated, ambiguous and muddy pictures are not as attractive, and they're not as sexy, and they don't work as well in opinion columns, and that's all well and good, but it means that we have a tendency to be slightly dishonest about our past, and I think that's probably a big problem.
Excellent. Thank you, Finn. Paul, would you have any remarks for either of the two comments?
Particularly on Shay's comment, I think having lived in Belgium as well, having lived in Scotland, I think there is something about small countries thinking a lot about not necessarily in a positive sense, thinking a lot about quantitatively, to the point of obsessing about their neighbours and what their neighbours think of them, which is often they don't think about them as much as they should.
Thanks a million. Paul? Etain?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't lived in small countries elsewhere, but I would think that's very much the case. I think that's true, that we shouldn't perhaps worry too much. And also that a lot of this is very tame. You know, I think you referred to casual labeling in one of your articles, Finn, a while ago, or, you know, casual stereotyping. It's not as serious as I'm sure some other communities might feel. But where I think we're different is we are probably facing a referendum on reunification, a united Ireland. Unionists are very aware of this. You could say, oh, well, you know, if it's not that, it was Catholicism, you know, it's always something, that could be a reaction. But it is actually very important because their British identity, I think many of them feel, even moderate ones I have spoken to, are very aware of this. So it's a different case from the other cases you've mentioned. And I think for that reason, more self-reflection is required. And any article in the Irish Times, you know, that might at times, because I actually admire the Irish Times for its balance, but at times when this imperial trope comes up, they notice in a flash. Now again, maybe that doesn't matter, but I think it's part of reconciliation now. So that's why it does matter.
Thank you, Etain. Neil, do you have any comments?
Yeah, thank you. You're quite right. Small countries living next to large countries where there are common histories and common bits of common linguistics, you know, sort of that relationship is always going to be, you know, sort of one-sided, but it is an important one, and it is not the same everywhere. And I say that because I'm kind of mindful of the fact that I am a comparativist, but my area of interest is in the former Soviet Union, where we have a big country doing certain things to a small country, which it really shouldn't be doing. And I think, you know, sort of, so you have to sort of move out from that commonality of large and small countries to also look at where the large countries are and their problems of creating identities for themselves. And I think, you know, sort of Britain has that problem. You know, sort of it is, you know, sort of on the edge of Europe. It has, of course, distanced itself from Europe. That has been partly something to do with identity and unsettled questions of identity. Questions of identity that are unsettled not simply because of, you know, sort of Britain versus Europe, but Britain versus itself. You know, sort of Britain was a country that also colonized itself, land enclosures, you know, sort of what happened in the Scottish Highlands, you know, sort of the rape of the English countryside for the Industrial Revolution. You know, sort of certain countries have elements of colonial guilt that works at different levels, and my area of interest, Russia is one, and the UK I think is another, and that creates certain historic problems for how you think about yourself, and then for how the small country deals with you. It adds and complicates that in a way that, you know, sort of I don't think is the same in Belgium as towards France. So I mean, if you go to Belgium, you go into a bookshop, yes, there are some books about Belgium, you know, and there are some books about French, and there are books in the different languages of Belgium. But if you go into an Irish bookshop, the Irish interest section, you know, it's massive, and you know, so you know, and that is because I think of the complexities of dealing with the next door neighbour, because of its own complexities. So Britain hasn't, you know, sort of, and England haven't had a honest, full recounting of their own identity and its sources. So it becomes a political live issue in a way that is perhaps not quite the case, or is much more of an effective political issue. It's not quite the case elsewhere, and I think that is something that complicates being British English in Ireland and being Irish and looking towards Britain and Europe. And you know, I'm not sure. I have no solution to that. I don't know how the UK would deal with that. I think it would require it unpacking a lot more than its imperial nature. It would also require it to unpack its regional biases and its class biases as well. But hopefully in the end it will have to do that when it has got over its current elite political hysteria about Englishness and returning to some glorious trading past that cannot be recreated in the current world.
Thanks a million, Neil. I think there's at least a million different avenues we could go down with this group, and I'm sure ARINS colleagues are keeping track of great topics for future discussions. I think the idea of class and region is also really interesting, Neil, to explore in the UK context. But I'd like us to go back to the core of the discussion for a little bit. And I'd like to, I'm driving at a question on unity in a few minutes as well. I haven't really decided which angle I'm going to take, but just so that you're all prepared. But looking at you, Neil, how long have you been in Ireland again?
Well, I started coming over in, I think, 1995 to visit my then future wife's family. And I moved here in January 2001.
2001, okay, so much has changed over the past more than, well, two decades, right? Much more than 2 decades, nearly 3. Can you reflect, perhaps? I mean, if there's a critical juncture, it was obviously there was a referendum and a campaign a couple of years ago in the shared history of these islands, and then going back into the 90s, there was a peace process and there was everything that went with that. Can you chart in any way, simplest terms possible, how your experiences of being an English person in Ireland has evolved since the mid-90s through to now, nearly 3 decades later?
That's really hard to do because obviously I've changed, so it's not simply my experience of being English that's changed. I'm probably less English than I was. I'm going to sort of tell you one kind of small anecdote though, which was we arrived back for a visit to Ireland on the morning of Good Friday, and we arrived and were picked up by some friends. Sort of educated, professional people. And the first question that Maura said was, what's happening in the negotiations? To which our friends replied, oh, we don't know, who cares? It's something up there, right? It's nothing to do with us, really. Our government is involved, it'd be great if there was peace, but, it's got nothing to do with us. And I think that kind of attitude has changed. I think people are, obviously they were not, sort of staunch nationalists, in the sense of at that point in time being Sinn Féin supporters. They probably are now, but I think that attitude has changed. I think Irish people have, partly because of what happened in the 2000s, sort of economic confidence that took a dent, but sort of that greater sort of confidence. That was associated not just with economic growth, but also sort of cultural things and sporting successes and that sort of things. I think Irish people are now much more interested in those relationships, and that to sort of come back to unity before you get there means, I think, that sort of people's attitude and interest in the question of unity is much more active than it would have been when I was first coming over, nearly 28 years ago.
Thanks, Neil. Now, Etain, you have a long relationship with Britain as well, and you spent time there and time here. Can you say anything, and then I'll go to you, Finn, next as well. Can you say anything about how things have changed in a similar fashion, your experience between these islands?
I think my caveat is a bit like Neil's, because I've changed as well. And as I said, I wouldn't have noticed things I notice now before I went to England and before I, had English friends and got married. So that's a caveat. I think the emphasis on a united Ireland has definitely increased. I think it's particularly among young people, though. I think among my age group, 50s, maybe 40s, mid-40s onwards perhaps, but definitely 50s onwards, it's less significant. And I think perhaps we're more aware. Brendan O'Leary and John Gary for ARINS did a survey of attitudes for the Irish Times with Pat Leahy as well, on attitudes to unification here, and one of the issues which would inhibit, if I've got the right survey, it's definitely O'Leary and Gary, one of the issues that would inhibit support for unification was fear of violence. And, you know, I don't think that's as dominant among younger people who don't remember the conflict. So there's a kind of romantic image, perhaps. So I think that has changed. For me, it's not just because Brexit has created also what I've noticed and what Finn has written about, and we're all here to talk about sort of latent anti-Englishness or a tame kind of anti-Englishness, perhaps. For me, we noticed a change just anecdotally coming back. I lived in Limerick from 95 until 99, and then we went back to England again. And then when we came back in 2001, which was really the Celtic Tiger beginning to take off, we noticed perhaps a smugness, taking ourselves very seriously more than I would have remembered growing up. And it was measured against the UK's decline. So I don't think it's just because of Brexit. I think it's very natural. Again, we were a small country. We were the poorest, as Paul was saying earlier. I mean, we qualified for Objective 1 aid in 1988, EU funding. Northern Ireland didn't because it was richer than us. Some regions of the UK did. So we've really been a huge success, and I think perhaps it's part of that. Arthur Ahi, who's retired professor from University of Ulster, who is a unionist, he has written and cited also identity-type literature that with the decline of Catholicism, the badge of identity, you know, has become more strongly about our relationship with England, because that's what distinguished us before from England. That's gone now. We're pluralist, we're modern, and that maybe that's a factor too. I think just that we succeeded so much in the Celtic Tiger and have been an astounding success in many ways, that perhaps it's just a phase in our evolution in some ways. But I would notice definitely more anti-Englishness. And Neil and I, we both had experience of our children being bullied, did we not, for English accents? So I don't remember any of that growing up really very much. So I think something changed, but it's probably a natural, hopefully, an evolution that we'll pass through as well.
Thanks very much, Etain. And I'll come to you in a moment, Paul, to give you a chance to respond. But Finn, our time living in the UK, I think as adults overlap, and my experience has always been, it's been exclusively positive, I have to say. But I'm wearing my own kind of privileges there, but my experiences all across England was always very positive, a kind of a young Irish person working in academia and working in politics. But your relationship with Britain goes back a lot further from when you were born. Mm-hmm. Do you have any views on how things have evolved over that time? Like, and whether it's Brexit as a turning point or anything else, can you point to any changes?
Well, I think my adult life has been spent in Britain, in London and in Cambridge, and over that time is when Brexit became the most potent. Perhaps the rhetoric around Brexit became the most nasty, both from here and in Britain, and from European media as well. And it was all very tense. So therefore, you know, my way of analysing how Englishness or Englishness to Ireland has changed is over that time period. And I think my answer is perhaps a little bit counterintuitive, which is that it hasn't really changed that much. In 2011, so the perception here is that Brexit was an English nationalist project. And Brexit not only came from English nationalism, but it kind of emboldened English nationalism and encouraged it to kind of take on more nastier forms. But in 2011, the census in the United Kingdom asked respondents to tick which identity they were, British, English, Scottish, Welsh. And in 2011, 58% of respondents said that their predominant identity was English. By 2021, only 15% of respondents said that their predominant identity was English, which seems like a very precipitous and vertiginous drop, especially, that doesn't make much sense over a time when Brexit was supposed to embolden English nationalism. We would have thought that number would have skyrocketed if we were to believe what many newspapers and commentators were saying. But if you look into it a little bit further, you realize in 2011, when 58% of people said that they were English, English was the first option in the list of identities. In 2021, English was the fifth option in the list of identities. So really, what people were doing was looking at the list of identities and picking the first one that vaguely applied to them. So what this tells us is not really much about how Brexit has changed Englishness or Britishness, or how the 6-7 years of the process has changed the national identity. It tells us that Englishness or Britishness is not a particularly deeply held thing at all. if it's that easily reduced to an alphabetical list, it implies that this idea we have in Ireland of Englishness as emboldened and nationalistic and deeply held and, you know, rabid is it doesn't apply to the facts at all. So if you ask me how things have changed, my experience is with my lens is through Brexit, and I say, well, Brexit hasn't really done a lot.
It tells us something about survey methodologies, though, right?
That's true, yeah.
Which is probably of interest to some people in the room. Paul, I'd like to give you a chance to respond, but I was gearing towards this question as well to ask you, of all our panelists, to meditate on England, Scotland, Wales, how that dynamic differs, how being a Scot in Ireland might differ from being an English person in Scotland, these being different but related, obviously. So I'd invite you to comment.
Well, I'll let you into a secret talking about methodology. The methodology I used when applying for this job 4 years ago was I said that given, and I was careful to say perhaps unfair, Irish stereotypes of the English establishment, having a working class Scottish Catholic as ambassador might be an interesting way of confounding my hosts. But I think, there's lots to unpick there. I was always very struck in the discussion about Britain and Europe by something Jean Monnet said in his memoirs when he was reflecting on why Britain, unlike the big continental and the smaller continental European countries, didn't sort of see the European project in the same way. And he went back to the war and he said Britain uniquely didn't feel the need to exercise the ghosts of its history. We hadn't been subject to fascism, we hadn't been subject to occupation. Now, neither had Ireland in different reasons, but you'd had different ghosts to exercise in the 20s, 30s and 40s. And I think there was something in that. And that we British people haven't thought that much for much of their modern history about their identity because they have this, in many ways, very strongly justified sense of pride in what the country accomplished standing alone, particularly during that first period of the Second World War. And I think that sort of carries forward in a way into sort of into modern Britain. You've seen the Scottish people rejecting independence in a referendum in 2014. Then the British people, in different ways, spread across the four nations, voting to leave the European Union. The debate kicking off again about Irish unification. So I think there are these sort of a lot of surface attention to these questions. I wonder whether under all that, and not least people reflecting on how complex the Brexit process has been, whether you might see, not least given the very complex geopolitical context of war in the Middle East, war in Eastern Europe, climate change, there's a lot to be going on externally that might cause people to reflect a bit more on whether further constitutional change at home is necessarily a high order priority. That's a very personal reflection. But I think there are, I think identity is evolving in different ways across these islands in complex ways to do with probably demography, class, education, region, age group. I don't think it's unilinear. I think it's very mixed and muddled. It's an ambassadorial cliche which I use a lot to talk about our complex shared history, but I think we live in a complex shared presence and will probably be going into a complex shared future as well.
Very well put. Does anyone from the audience gathered here wish to say anything or ask anything, question or comment?
Thank you. Eve Patton from Trinity College Dublin, and I agree with much of what I've heard already, but the term I want to introduce is something that hasn't come up a great deal yet. Class has been mentioned, region has been mentioned, culture has been mentioned, sport has been mentioned, but I wonder to what extent the panel feel that critical debates on what Englishness now is inevitably come down to questions of race, and that at the moment conversations about race and England and Englishness are really what are driving forward some of the debates that the Irish are watching from a slightly more comfortable distance.
I think that's an extremely useful question, because this idea of Englishness is a thing that is unchanging and unevolving, obviously, can't be true. And then there's Paul Gillespie to your left as well.
I'm involved with a project on constitutional futures after Brexit. And I was wanting to take up the devolution question. It seems to me you can argue that the UK's union is in a very uncertain place compared historically. And there's a prudential aspect to the interest in that the future of that union, not just out of Irish unification, out of Scotland, but out of its own ability to manage these transitions, notwithstanding, as the ambassador said, the external constraints and interest. That's of course going to affect it. But over the next 10 years, the intersection of Ireland and British identities have to do with that. And the origin of a lot of the problem is not just in Irish psychological attitudes to Englishness, but actually in the fundamental constitution of the UK itself.
What's the question then, Paul?
What weight should we put on that constitutional question in Britain, looking at it from Ireland?
Excellent. I'd like to trailer Paul Gillespie's forthcoming paper with the IIEA that's on this exact topic as well, on the future of the union. Would anybody like to jump in on either the questions about race or about the union? Neil can start.
I think the question about the place of race in English debates is very well made. Yes, I mean I think it's become so dominant and it's covered over so many other things that it's not a full debate. Now maybe that's just a sort of stage that things have to go through. That you have to get some of those more binary issues of white, non-white dealt with before you can move on to look at all the other elements of English come Britishness fully and get a better accounting. But I think it plays into the problem, which is that there is a discourse amongst a certain part of the British elite which wants to hold to certain eternal values and identities for instrumental reasons, and they're quite happy to see that debate ricochet around the question of race, because it feeds into that. That's me being a bit Manichean and conspiratorial, but there you go. And I think possibly certain elements of constitutional change are necessary to begin to break down that political class and approach. So I wouldn't see those two issues as being all that. They're not as different as on the face of it we might assume.
And just a quick follow-up, if I may, without getting overly metaphysical. I think that the first remark is really thoughtful, or it's making me reflect. Has your understanding of Englishness changed by this passage of time with the debates pertaining to race in the UK? And does that change your experience in Ireland as an English person?
Yes, I mean, as I say, I wouldn't have necessarily really thought about Englishness too much. It was a thing that was lodged into certain pastimes rather than an identity, and watching it and experiencing it and performing being English. As one kind of has to, just by speaking, I have seen it as being something much more important than I would have done before, and that importance, I think, has become more prominent in British political life, partly because of devolution, partly because of Brexit, and partly because of the way that certain ideas of Englishness have been used, culturally and politically over the past years. So it is evolving, and I think it's evolving at a much greater rate than it did, looking back through my childhood, and early adulthood. It wouldn't have been. It just wasn't there. I can't remember. There were a few books about being British, being English, that came out of people like Paul Gilmore and those, but they were exceptions rather than the norm. So this sort of acceleration, I think, is there. It's positive. It's not gone as far as it should. It's got sidetracked into certain binary oppositions, which are sort of going to be difficult to overcome. But I think it's something that's going to increase over coming time, and hopefully sort of begin to take shapes and forms which are much more progressive. But I think sort of that helping that along, forcing people to sort of begin to further sort of disaggregate their Englishness into new political and social identities is going to take political change as well as the sort of intellectual change and debate that's already going on.
Well, I think on race, I think it seems very connected to the Brexiteer element as well. Again, all of this is anecdotal, really, but I think even statistically, the UK would have been seen as a highly successful multicultural society, more so than other countries such as France. So I suppose one of the most disturbing things is seeing this rise of racism and the Rwanda, Braverman rhetoric that to many of us, I think on both islands, is so surprising. That wasn't the England I knew. And many people I've spoken to, including diplomats who worked in London, it's quite shocking to see that change. And I suppose manipulating nationalist populist feelings for votes is not uncommon. It happens all over the world, and I think that's what we're seeing. I think something that, again, in terms of gaps in knowledge, while Ireland has this hugely successful immigration process at the moment of 20% having been born outside the island, I think we sometimes forget perhaps that in England that has been going on for centuries. So actually the number of non-white British or English people is far greater, really, if you look over the centuries, and then the proportion here, and you can see that when you go to certain cities. So I think that, perhaps because of the rise of Brexiteerism, we don't recognize what a tolerant, open society England once was. And I think my impression of people my age, Neil's age, is that that was quite part of the education system to be accepting. And somehow, perhaps that has changed, as Neil has said, to essentially to get votes. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, this kind of populist thing's being manipulated. So yeah, I think it's a big factor that's damaging to our relations.
Thanks, Etain. Paul, do you have anything you'd like to share?
I think, having lived in a number of European countries, I would say that Britain's ethnic makeup is more fully reflected at the top of our government, politics, media, business, society than it is in other countries I've lived in, including in Ireland. So I don't deny there are issues, but I think the picture is more positive than could sometimes be painted.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I also would just say on how defining Englishness and the interplay of race there is that defining any national identity is an unbelievably complicated and difficult thing to do. So the same goes for defining Frenchness and Irishness, and reminded of George Orwell, of course, the great English essayist and the kind of chronicler of what Englishness was. And even when he tries to define Englishness, he's reduced to listing attributes. English people like queuing, and English people drink tea. Irish people like queuing, and Irish people drink tea too. So it's for a man as great as Orwell can't even do it. And then the other things he tries to do is he tries to say like, oh well, actually maybe Englishness is kind of abstract reverence for the rule of law or belief in democratic institutions. Well, that's a very commonly held Western disposition too. And that's not to say that the West is a homogenous place or that Englishness and Irishness are the same. To say that no one has really been able to put words to national identity in a very effective way. And I just think that's probably quite important to keep in the back of our heads when we're talking about Englishness and how that interplays with class and race and gender, we don't even know what Englishness is.
Is that a help or a hindrance, do you think, to our relations in these islands?
I think it's kind of constructive ambiguity can always be helpful.
Yeah. Okay, good point, well made. I'm going to give everyone a chance in a moment to sum up with my long-promised unity question.
It'll be up to the people of Northern Ireland and Ireland in referendums, if and when they come, to decide whether they want to change their constitutional position. It seems to me that the the debate here, we were talking about it before in the green room, as it were. You no longer hear, or you hardly ever hear, Irish voices shouting or with banners saying, England out of Ireland or Britain out of Ireland. It seems to me the debate about the constitutional future, not least thanks to projects such as ARINS, is more rich, more diverse, more thoughtful than it was. It's got a long way to go, I think, and it could go in a number of different directions, but it feels to me a sort of healthy and respectful debate, and that feels to me a good and a happy place to be in.
Thanks very much, Paul. Lovely point in which to end from yourself. Finn?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is just to continue extending sympathy and empathy to nationalities that aren't our own. And, it seems like a bit of a mawkish answer, but, we've talked a lot about how, anti-Irishness or anti-Englishness, but we should actually remember that the relationship between England and Ireland, we're actually extraordinarily lucky. They are very close countries that have their difficulties, but they're close and they're interdependent, and Ireland's home to many English people and a good home to many English people, and England is a good home to many Irish people, a place where Irish people can succeed economically and culturally. And so when we're talking about kind of really difficult things like reunification and what that means, a really good place to start would say taking stock of the things that we should be grateful about, and actually how strong the relationship is.
Thanks, Finn. Neil?
I think it's a discussion that is going to happen, but I don't think it's going to be the most important discussion about unity. I think it's discussions need to be more about sort of what it means to be a unionist and to be and to be from the north of Ireland than discussions about Englishness. Englishness will come up as a part of that, but I don't think it should be something that's privileged. In fact, efforts to bind unionist identity to some notions of Englishness are probably things that should be resisted as part of the discussions about that. That said, I think that even if there is a referendum, that in all probability it's going to take more than one and a larger passage of time from the events of the recent past to play all those things out. So it's not something that I see as going to be determinant of that result. I think that result will be determined negatively in terms of unification first time round anyway.
Thanks very much, Neil. Final word to you, Etain.
Where I come to this from is more an idea of pluralism and tolerance rather than specifically or just about unionism. Because there is, again, the ARINS Irish Times survey has found there's about 1/3 of unionists that nothing will make them want to be part of United Ireland, no matter what you change. And that third is going to be the group that is, I suppose, potentially, potentially there could be violence, but also, is problematic is the wrong word, but that they are not going to be convinced by anything. So I wouldn't overstate how changing these things would help get a kind of 100% consensus for United Ireland and make things easier. It won't, because I think the minority that are trenchant will remain so. However, on the basis of pluralism, and back to the title of this seminar, I think there needs to be an awareness here that Britishness is an ethnic minority and should be treated with the same respect as any other ethnic minority. So I approach it really from a broader view, because I don't think, because of our very unique and close relationship, I think perhaps we're not as aware of that. So that would be my thought. Finally, this is very anecdotal. So I think we do need sort of survey evidence on what attitudes are. I think, that would be very helpful. But thank you.
Okay, here. I'm sure the guys on ARINS are listening. Paul has a final remark.
Just one thing that I should have mentioned. The Foreign Office conducts a survey in, I think, about 40 or 50 countries around the world each year, measuring perceptions of Britain. And I was flattered to discover, and I will sort of cite it in my annual self-assessment, that Irish perceptions of Britain have actually improved significantly over the past 12 months, which I'm sure is to do with sort of wider political factors and maybe economic factors as well. But there has been, to Etain's call for some survey data, there has been some good survey data in the recent past.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure your leadership has contributed to this as well, Paul, just needless to say. I've really enjoyed myself, and thank you to all of you here. This feels like I'm in mass, by the way. I never realised that the pews here really does feel like I'm up on the altar. So I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you all for your indulgence and your patience. Finn McRedmond, Neil Robinson, Paul Johnston, and Etain Tannam, thank you very much for your time. And if you could just thank everybody in the traditional way, and thank you for being here.